What happens when a beloved country music icon walks onto a late night set expecting a conversation about her career and charity work, only to find herself facing down a host who seems more interested in scoring points than showing respect? In just 30 seconds, one comment from Greg Gutfeld would turn a routine interview into an explosive confrontation that nobody in that studio would ever forget. Faith Hill sat down on the couch that evening with a warm smile, her blonde hair styled perfectly, wearing an elegant navy blue dress that spoke to her signature grace and sophistication. She had done hundreds of interviews over her decades-long career, promoting albums, discussing her marriage to Tim McGraw, sharing stories about their family and their shared passion for giving back to communities in need. This was supposed to be another one of those easy conversations, a chance to talk about her latest project, helping build schools in rural communities across the South. Greg Gutfeld opened the segment with what seemed like a standard introduction, welcoming Faith to the show with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The audience applauded as she waved, settling into her seat with the practiced ease of someone who had been in front of cameras since she was barely out of her teens. "So Faith, thanks for being here," Gutfeld began, leaning back in his chair with an air of casual confidence. "I gotta say, country music, it's been a while since you had a real hit, hasn't it?" Faith's smile faltered for just a moment, caught off guard by the opening jab disguised as a question. She recovered quickly, her southern charm kicking in as she laughed it off. "Well, I've been focusing more on family and philanthropy these days, but I'm always working on new music when the inspiration strikes." Gutfeld nodded, but there was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't really listening. Right, philanthropy. That's what celebrities do when the spotlight starts to dim, isn't it? Find a cause, get some good press, stay relevant." The audience went quiet. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd, but mostly there was just silence. Faith's posture straightened, her smile now fixed in place, but no longer reaching her eyes either. "I think that's a pretty cynical way to look at people trying to help others, Greg." "Cynical? No, I'd call it honest," Gutfeld replied, his voice taking on that tone of mock innocence that hosts use when they know they're being provocative. "I mean, let's be real here. You're building schools in places where, people probably can't even afford to send their kids anyway. Seems like maybe there are bigger problems to solve, but hey, at least you get to cut a ribbon and take some photos, right?" Faith took a slow breath, and anyone watching closely could see her jaw tighten. "Actually, Greg, these are communities I grew up around. Communities where education is the only path out of poverty for a lot of kids. The schools we're building provide free breakfast and lunch programs, after-school care, and resources that these children would never have access to otherwise. It's not about photo opportunities. It's about giving kids a chance." Gutfeld waved his hand dismissively. Sure, very noble. But come on, you've got to admit there's a certain, savior complex to the whole thing. Rich celebrities swooping in to save the poor rural folks. They managed just fine before you showed up, didn't they? The tension in the studio was palpable now. Faith's publicist, sitting off to the side, looked like she wanted to jump up and end the interview right there. But Faith, to her credit, kept her composure, even as her voice took on a sharper edge. They didn't manage just fine, actually. Dropout rates in these areas are some of the highest in the country. Teen pregnancy, drug abuse, lack of opportunities, these are real problems that real families are dealing with every single day. And if I have the resources and the platform to help make even a small difference, then yes, I'm going to do that. "But who are you to decide what these communities need?" Gutfeld pressed, leaning forward now, clearly enjoying the confrontation. "I mean, you live in, a mansion in Nashville, multiple properties, private planes, and you're going to tell people in rural Mississippi or Alabama what's best for their kids." Faith's eyes flashed. "I'm not telling anyone anything. I'm working with local leaders, teachers, parents who have been asking for help for years. People who know exactly what their communities need because they live there. They raise their families there. I'm just helping provide the funding and resources to make it happen. Gutfeld smirked. So you're a checkbook. That's your big contribution. My big contribution, Faith said slowly, her voice dropping lower, more controlled, is caring enough to listen and to act, which is more than I can say for people who sit behind a desk making judgments about situations they know nothing about, the audience murmured, sensing that this was escalating beyond typical television banter. Gutfeld's producer was making frantic hand signals from behind the camera, but Gutfeld seemed determined to push further. Wow, okay, so now I'm the bad guy because I'm asking questions? Isn't that what journalists do? Journalists ask questions to inform and enlighten, Faith shot back. What you're doing is trying to tear down someone's charitable work for what? Entertainment? To prove you're clever? Gutfeld laughed, but there was no humor in it. No, what I'm doing is pointing out the hypocrisy of Hollywood elites. And yeah, that includes country music stars who like to pretend they're still just regular folks from Mississippi, even though they haven't lived that life in 30 years. Faith stood up abruptly, her microphone nearly falling from her lapel. You know what, Greg? I came here tonight to talk about helping children get an education, to talk about communities that are overlooked and underserved. But clearly, you're more interested in cheap shots and gotcha moments than having any kind of meaningful conversation. Oh, come on, don't be so sensitive, Gutfeld said, gesturing for her to sit back down. This is television. This is what we do. If you can't handle a little pushback, maybe you should stick to softball interviews on morning shows where everyone just tells you how amazing you are. Faith's face flushed red, and for a moment, it looked like she might actually sit back down and continue the fight. But instead, she reached up, unclipped her microphone, and placed it carefully on the coffee table between them. You know what the difference is between us, Greg? I actually care about making the world a little bit better. You just care about making yourself feel important by belittling other people. And I don't need to sit here and be insulted by someone who clearly has no interest in doing anything positive with his platform. The studio was dead silent now. Even the crew had stopped moving. Everyone frozen in place, watching this unfold. Gutfeld's smirk had faded slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like surprise that she was actually walking away. So you're just going to leave? That's your response? Run away? Faith turned back to look at him, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. No, Greg. I'm choosing not to waste another second on someone who mistakes cruelty for courage and thinks being a bully makes him brave. There's a difference. She started to walk toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply on the studio floor. Gutfeld, perhaps realizing that this was making him look worse by the second, tried to recover with humor. Ladies and gentlemen, Faith Hill, everyone, apparently charity work doesn't include having a sense of humor. That stopped her. Faith turned around one more time, and the look on her face was pure steel. A sense of humor requires something actually being funny, Greg. Nothing about this conversation has been funny. It's been disrespectful. It's been mean-spirited. And honestly, it's been beneath both of us. But mostly you. One of the producers stepped forward, trying to de-escalate. Faith, maybe we can just take a break, reset, and start over with some different questions. But Faith shook her head. No, I don't think so, because this isn't about the questions. This is about respect, and when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them. She looked directly at Gutfeld. You showed me exactly who you are tonight. Someone who thinks tearing others down makes him look bigger. Someone who takes cheap shots at people trying to do good work because it's easier than actually contributing something meaningful yourself. Gutfeld's face had gone from amused to irritated. You don't know anything about what I contribute. You're right, Faith agreed. I don't, because you spent this entire interview talking about me instead of anything you've ever done to help anyone. That's telling. Another producer approached, this one more senior, his expression tight with stress. Faith, please, let's just talk about this. We can edit. We can reshoot. But Faith was already removing her earpiece. There's nothing to talk about. I was invited here as a guest, and I was treated like a target. I don't need this, and I certainly don't need to subject myself to any more of his. She gestured toward Gutfeld. Whatever this is supposed to be. Gutfeld stood up now, his own frustration starting to show. This is called having a conversation, Faith. This is called not just accepting everything at face value. Maybe if more people asked tough questions instead of just fawning over celebrities, we'd all be better off. Tough questions? Faith's laugh was sharp and humorless. You didn't ask me one tough question, Greg. You made assumptions. You insulted my work. You questioned my motives. And you did it all with this smug little attitude like you're so much smarter than everyone else. That's not journalism. That's just being a jerk. The audience, which had been silent throughout most of this exchange, suddenly erupted in applause. It wasn't universal. Some people sat with their hands in their laps, uncomfortable with the whole situation, but a significant portion of the crowd was clapping loudly, clearly on Faith's side. Gutfeld looked out at them with obvious annoyance. Oh, great. Now we're clapping for people who can't take criticism? This is what's wrong with America. No, Faith said firmly. What's wrong with America is people like you who think being cruel is the same as being smart. Who think you have to tear someone down to build yourself up. I've been in this business for over 20 years, Greg. I've dealt with tough interviews, hard questions, real criticism from people who actually knew what they were talking about. This isn't that. This is just you trying to make yourself feel relevant by attacking someone who came here in good faith. A commercial break was being called for, the floor director frantically signaling, but Faith was already heading for the exit. Gutfeld called after her, his voice taking on a mocking tone. Go ahead and run, Faith. I'm sure your publicist will spin this as my fault. That's what you people do, right? Always the victim. That made Faith stop one more time. She didn't turn around completely, just looked back over her shoulder. I'm not a victim, Greg. I'm someone with enough self-respect to know when a situation isn't worth my time. You might want to try developing some of that yourself. And then she was gone, pushing through the studio doors and disappearing into the hallway beyond. The audience sat in stunned silence, not sure if they should clap, boo, or just wait to see what happened next. Gutfeld stood there for a moment, clearly thrown off his game, before forcing a laugh and looking at the camera. Well, that was dramatic. Guess we struck a nerve, huh? But nobody was laughing with him. The energy in the room had completely shifted. His co-panelists, who usually jumped in with jokes and support, were noticeably quiet. Even his most loyal audience members seemed uncomfortable with how the whole thing had played out. Gutfeld tried to push forward, making a comment about thin-skinned celebrities and the importance of free speech, but his words felt hollow in the wake of what had just happened. Behind the scenes, Faith's publicist was already on her phone, typing furiously, while Faith herself stood in the hallway, taking deep breaths, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. A production assistant approached cautiously, holding out a bottle of water. Are you okay, Miss Hill? Faith took the water gratefully, her voice much softer now, tired. I'm fine. I should have walked out sooner. I kept thinking maybe it would get better. Maybe he'd actually want to have a real conversation. But he just wanted to score points. Back in the studio, they were trying to salvage the segment, bringing out the next guest early, but the damage was done. The entire crew knew this would be the clip that went viral, the moment that everyone would be talking about. Not because of anything clever Gutfeld had said, but because a respected artist had stood up, called him out, and walked away with her dignity intact. One of Gutfeld's producers pulled him aside during the next commercial break. Their conversation was brief and clearly tense, with the producer gesturing emphatically while Gutfeld defended himself, insisting he'd just been doing his job, asking the questions nobody else would ask. But even he seemed to know he'd crossed a line, pushed too hard, mistaken antagonism for wit. In the green room, Faith was gathering her things, still shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't understand what happened," she said to her publicist. "We sent over talking points, topics I wanted to discuss. Did he just ignore all of that?" Her publicist, a woman in her 40s who'd been handling celebrity crises for years, sighed heavily. "He wanted to create a moment. He wanted something that would get attention, get clicks. Unfortunately, he picked the wrong person to mess with." "I don't want this to become a thing," Faith said quietly. "I don't want this to overshadow the actual work we're doing." "I know," her publicist replied. "But honey, you handled that perfectly. You stood up for yourself. You called him out on his behavior, and you left with your head held high. People are going to respect that." A knock on the door interrupted them. It was the senior producer who'd tried to get Faith to stay, looking exhausted and apologetic. "Miss Hill, I just want to say I'm so sorry about what happened out there. That was completely unprofessional, and it's not the kind of show we try to run." Faith nodded, accepting his apology with grace, even though she was still upset. "I appreciate that, but you might want to talk to your host about the difference between provocative and just plain rude." The producer grimaced. "Trust me, that conversation is already happening." Meanwhile, back on set, Gutfeld was finishing up the show, but his usual swagger was noticeably diminished. He made a few half-hearted jokes about the incident, trying to play it off as Faith being unable to handle the heat, but even his most supportive audience members weren't buying it. The whole thing had been too uncomfortable, too mean-spirited, too clearly an example of a host punching down at someone who'd come on the show in good faith. As the show wrapped and the cameras stopped rolling, Gutfeld pulled off his microphone and headed straight for his dressing room, bypassing the usual post-show meeting with producers. His team exchanged worried glances, knowing that this incident would require serious damage control. But the truth was, there wasn't much they could do. The whole thing had been captured on camera, and soon it would be everywhere, dissected and analyzed by everyone with an opinion and an internet connection. Faith, for her part, left the building through a side exit, avoiding any lingering press or fans who might have gathered. She sat in the back of the car that was waiting to take her back to her hotel, staring out the window at the New York City streets passing by, still processing what had just happened. She'd been blindsided, attacked for doing work she was genuinely passionate about, all for the sake of some host's ego and his need to prove he was edgy and unafraid to ask tough questions. But as the initial shock and anger began to fade, Faith felt something else, something unexpected. Pride. She'd stood up for herself. She'd refused to sit there and be insulted, to be made to feel small or ashamed of trying to help others. She'd called out behavior that deserved to be called out, and she'd done it with strength and clarity. Whatever happened next, whatever narrative emerged from this incident, she knew she'd handled herself with integrity. Her phone was already blowing up with texts and calls, people who'd been watching, colleagues and friends reaching out to offer support. She ignored them for now, needing just a few more minutes of quiet before dealing with the inevitable fallout. But scrolling through the messages, she could see the overwhelming support. People thanking her for standing up to a bully, for not backing down, for showing that respect matters even in an era where outrage and confrontation seem to be the currency of entertainment. Back at the studio, the crew was packing up equipment and discussing what they'd witnessed in hushed, excited tones. Everyone had an opinion about what had happened, who was right, who was wrong, whether Faith had overreacted or if Gutfeld had gone too far. But there was a general consensus among most of them that the host had been unnecessarily harsh, that he'd been looking for a fight rather than a conversation, and that Faith had every right to walk away. Gutfeld's executive producer was already on the phone with network executives, trying to get ahead of the story, explaining the situation and assuring them that it wouldn't happen again. But everyone in that building knew that this was going to be a problem. That this was the kind of incident that could seriously damage a show's reputation, especially if it was perceived as a host bullying a guest who'd come on to discuss charitable work. The real test would come in the hours and days that followed, as clips of the confrontation spread across social media, as think pieces were written and commentary was offered from all corners of the internet. But in that moment, immediately after it happened, there was just the raw reality of what had occurred. A conversation that had gone completely off the rails, a host who'd pushed too hard, and a guest who'd refused to accept being treated with anything less than the respect she deserved. Faith Hill had walked onto that set as a guest, an accomplished artist and philanthropist ready to discuss work that mattered to her. She'd walked off that set as something more, someone who'd drawn a line and refused to cross it, someone who'd shown that kindness and charity work weren't weaknesses to be mocked, but strengths to be celebrated. And while the incident would certainly generate headlines and controversy, there was no question about who had come out of that confrontation with their dignity and integrity intact. As the night wore on and the immediate chaos began to settle, one thing became crystal clear to everyone who'd witnessed what happened. This wasn't going to be remembered as a moment of great television or brilliant hosting. It was going to be remembered as the night a respected artist refused to be diminished, stood up for her values, and walked away from someone who valued confrontation over conversation, ratings over respect, and his own ego over basic human decency. And in doing so, she'd reminded everyone watching that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in someone else's need to tear you down.